I hope everyone had a chance to read the formal announcement, which had a bunch of background on the topic for today, the Ukraine war, reminding everyone how it started, when it started, the fact that it has now gone on for over 18 months with no sign, at least no obvious signs in sight of it ending. Very quickly after it began, the United States, our president had announced we're not going to be sending troops. Ukraine's not a NATO country, and obviously to send American troops would be risking a major confrontation directly with Russia. The European countries basically felt the same. And what we all came up with was what we thought were going to be and what were intended to be crushing economic sanctions to squeeze Russia and its economy, to put pressure on them, and in particular on Putin, to agree that they should stop this war. It's a bad idea. It's hurting everybody, and in particular, it's hurting them, and come to the negotiating table and end it. It has not had that effect. Maybe it still will, and there's actually opinions on both sides of that. All the major news media, Time Magazine, Newsweek, The Economist, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy Magazine, everybody's weighed in at some point or another in the last several months with how and if, or reverse that order, if and if so, how the economic sanctions are working, and if they're not, why they're not. And we're going to be hearing today about, with a pretty close and deep dive into this topic. And there's going to be some eye-opening revelations here. Our speaker, David, and I talked for a while about some of these things, and it just seemed like a great topic for a presentation to the FANG. David's going to be looking at not just the sanctions and whether and how they may or may not be working, but also what the Russians have been doing to evade some of the more onerous effects of some of the sanctions. And in particular, looking at the de-dollarizing of the Russian economy, with Western economies largely based ultimately on the strength of the US dollar. That's how the sanctions largely have an effect. And if Russia can de-dollarize its economy, that can thwart some of the effects of the sanctions. That could have the other effect of making the Russians more dependent on the yuan. And that, of course, then has ripple effects as well. So Dave's going to take a look at some of that stuff. And it's going to be an interesting discussion. Again, just a reminder to everybody to feel free to interrupt with any questions as David goes along in his presentation. And a brief introduction on David. Some of you will recognize David has spoken to us several times, a number of times in the past, and several times just in the past 2 years, looking at various aspects of the Ukraine war and its ripple effects, its effects on global energy prices, global supply chains. And David is the founder and the CEO of the Core Global Advisory, which is a worldwide risk management commodities consulting firm. David has had over 30 years dealing with these kinds of issues in his career. He has worked and lived in Russia, in Mexico, has dealt with companies in many parts of the world. He speaks Russian, and that has helped make him very fluent, not just with the language, but with the issues that we're going to be hearing a bit about today. David is he's the 3-time past chair of the San Diego World Affairs Council. He is the 6-time past chair of the San Diego Sister Cities program, and in particular was instrumental in creating the sister city program between San Diego and Vladivostok in Russia. And David, by the way, if I say anything wrong, be sure to fix it and correct me once I turn this over to you in just a minute here. David has his undergraduate degree, a tailor-made degree, by the way, in political economy from San Diego State University. He's had at least 15 years of pretty solid experience speaking widely to groups like this, to companies on a variety of subjects in his field of commodities, worldwide economic issues, and worldwide political impacts and diplomatic issues. Let me turn it over to you, David, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Dan. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to be here and discuss the current situation, or there and abouts, the situation in Russia and in regards to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, it's been a long, unpleasant road for those of us that were active in that part of the world. It's been a huge shock for everyone, devastating shock, and has certainly altered the course of affairs worldwide. Of course, if it wasn't going to happen there, it may well have happened. Well, it may well happen elsewhere yet. So Dan did touch on an important aspect of what my presentation is going to be about, and that was the idea in the first days after the war started in February of 2022, the West embarked on essentially an economic and financial war against Russia, providing arms to Ukraine, maybe enough to not lose, certainly enough to not win. But the West would take the kind of the quieter route, if you will, the less bloody route for us of economic sanctions and financial sanctions. It's turned out that it was wishful thinking, and those sanctions will have a substantial effect on the course of affairs in the 21st century. And I think when the historians really get down to writing things and look back on U.S. involvement in the first quarter to first half of the 21st century, the sanctions will turn out to have been a profound own goal, but it will take time for that to, we'll let the historians write that. But in the meantime, let's take a look at where things are at. So I'm going to share my screen, my slide deck, and I'm going to presume that everybody can see it. And let's march forward. So the understanding was, with all these sanctions, that it was going to not just handicap the Russian economy, but really shock it and maybe even shut it down. Well, it hasn't worked out that way. Looking here at the S&P Global Composite, the Purchasing Managers Index for Russia over the last 2 years or so, this shock here was the initial shock to the invasion, which the various economic and financial sanctions, not just, but also the shock of the war itself in Russia, created an immense amount of turbulence for businesses, institutions, and people trying to conduct their affairs. People didn't know what to do. Channels were blocked. But what's happened is those channels have increasingly unblocked. And certainly for Russia itself, this lighter color band is manufacturing, and then the darker is services. Russia is a services-dominated economy, despite the media never-ending pounding discussion about Russia as an oil and gas country. It is important, but it's not everything. It's not even close to everything. About 2/3 of Russians work in the services sector. They don't work in energy. They don't work in manufacturing. Manufacturing is held up surprisingly well, in part because of the need to supply the war machine, if you will, in Ukraine. So there's really been quite a substantial boom in capital investment in the manufacturing sector in Russia, particularly this year. And manufacturing of armaments is surging forth while we in the West are kind of trying to figure out what to do. And maybe there would be some expansion in munitions manufacturing sometime in 2024. The Russians, after a huge shock and bloody setback in Ukraine, have by and large gotten their act together, realize that they're in a real fight, and are firstly seeking not to lose, and are still, from the Kremlin's perspective, out to win. The Russian general public wasn't interested in this war, didn't want to see this war, but I will tell you, now that the war is underway, the majority of the Russian public doesn't want to see Russia lose. But what we're looking at here is a graphic that shows an economy in very strong condition. Looking at the Purchasing Managers Index going back to 2008, you can see the shock of the 2007-2008 credit crisis and the global recession. You can see the shock of the pandemic, and you can see the shock of the invasion of Ukraine, just keeping things in perspective. And remember that for the PMI indexes, anything above 50 is an expanding economy, anything under 50 is a contraction. Another indicator is that railway traffic in Russia continues to surge. Yes, trade has been reconfiguring very much away from Russia's heavy dependence on Europe as a export market, but also as a source of imports. But netting out, whether that trade moves elsewhere, it all in all, it would net equal. So the fact that you're getting this surge in railway traffic is in fact a clear sign of robust activity in Russia's domestic economy. Now, you can take my word for it, or you can go to the IMF most recent projections. This is July 2023, showing that the IMF expects Russia to grow 1.5% this year and 1.3% next year. Pretty decent numbers, actually, when you look at Europe. It's not bad. And for the assumption it was that we would be looking at lots of big, ugly, negative numbers that would result in either a withdrawal from Ukraine by the Kremlin or some sort of regime change driven by the Russian people or the oligarchs or somebody like that. And the view going forward is for sustained, pretty decent growth. Back in the first decade of this century, these very strong growth numbers were really a reflection of the catastrophic 1990s. The Russian economy got its act together the first decade. Energy prices were strong, energy production was good, but also manufacturing was good. Service sector was good. People just got organized again and really began to build, not just survive, but build and then thrive. And then the recession hit globally, which really hammered the Russian corporate sector quite severely. But looking forward, growth looks pretty good. Another thing, so most of the statistics about the sizes of economies, et cetera, are based on exchange rate data. It's a financial perspective of ranking or health. But on a purchasing power parity basis, is another way of looking at economic strength. And for those of you that read The Economist, their McDonald's index is an old standby for measuring the relative competitiveness of economies. You know, what does the cost of a Big Mac? What's a Big Mac cost? And if everything was the same, the Big Mac would cost the same in every country, in different currencies, of course, but by exchange rate, they would all be the same value. But it turns out that in the real world, there are a lot of differences in value. And from a purchasing power parity perspective, Russia is now the 5th largest economy in the world, has passed Germany. So, I mean, it's really important to evaluate things, get away from narratives and kind of urban legends, you know, like this endless talk about how, you know, Russian GDP is equal to Italy, which may be more of a slam against, you know, Italy is as much as it is a slam against the Russians. But, you know, in a combat type situation, you know, it's what is it that you're able to do? What is it that you're able to produce? What is your capacity? What is your real capacity? Not Hollywood, not some sort of inflated number. You know, we here in the West, in terms of equity markets, we're always talking about multiples. Well, what does that really mean? So actually, the fact that Russia's ranked number 5 should be is a sobering indicator.
Hey, David, a couple of questions. When did when did that Russian surpassing Germany event happen? Was that within the past year? Was that
Yeah,
within the
that was this year.
year?
Yeah,
Just this
this
past
year.
year.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the other one is, you know, a few years ago, it was pretty common to hear a lot of discussion about how you couldn't trust information coming out of China because they would falsify some of their economic reporting, yada, yada, yada. Is there any concern about that with numbers coming out of Russia in the last 18 months to 2 years?
For sure. You know, there's an old saying, trust but verify. Then for China, those that were serious about about analyzing the Chinese economy took the time to find indicators that would tell them something real. So electricity consumption turned out to be one of those numbers for China that would provide data that was not altered or shaded in some way by some entity in China or Beijing. Yes, the reporting has been reduced coming out of Russia. Some statistics are no longer released. That there's suspicion on the part of some in the West that the quality of the statistics being released is poor. But you can look at, certainly in terms of imports, there's a lot of data that actually you can look at other countries' data to confirm. And another thing, you know, there's a common perception is that, you know, there's no free media, no open media in Russia, that it's all run by the Kremlin. Well, that's not true. The Kremlin controls national TV and a lot of the narrative that's on that. But in terms of the business world, for example, a publication like Kommersant, and I'm not reading the paper version of Kommersant, I'm reading on the online, and they are able to soberly talk around. Russians have a lot of practice of this, about how to not mention the unmentionable words or phrases. Why be stupid? Just be smart and find a way to use language. But the quality of reporting in the business sector remains very high, and they learned market economics the hard way. They didn't go to university. They got it live coming out of the Soviet era and rebuilding an economy there. So actually the quality of data, in my view, coming out of Russia is pretty high. But again, trust but verify, and a lot of the trade data is drawn on government statistics or statistics produced in other countries by other governments, many of which are quite opposed to Russia and the Kremlin these days. Continuing on here, one of the issues that is a problem for the Russian economy right now is a labor shortage. Part of that is driven by needing to draw people, to mobilize people for the war. There were two waves of immigration, if you will, from Russia in the first weeks following the start of the war, February 2022, and then following the partial mobilization in September 2022. There were two large waves of generally young, technically competent, largely male, but not entirely, people headed abroad. Some of them have returned, but most of them have stayed abroad. There was a shock, a recessionary shock in the services sector in Russia in the fall of 2022, quite a rebound in the first quarter of 2023. But in the manufacturing sector in particular, they're short on labor. And the big complaint of the defense, the military sector, is that they can't get enough people. They are wanting to work triple shifts, and they are just not able to staff them adequately. And one of the consequences of that labor shortage is rising real wages, but it's also rising, it's rising inflation, certainly a rising tide, if you will, that's lifting those boats of inflation. One of the, not everything is rosy in Russia's domestic economy. This year, well, going back to late 2022, quite a strong surge in cash and circulation. This is another indicator of inflationary pressures building inside. This has nothing to do with exchange rate. In this instance, it doesn't have anything to do with supply chain problems or labor shortages, but it certainly was a real warning signal for pressure building, inflationary pressures building in the economy, that the economy was overheating. I mean, we've seen just a raft of statistics that just say hot economy. So in July, the Russian central bank, which was expected to increase interest rates 50 basis points, in fact, increase them a full 100 basis points. That was before the ruble crisis, if you will, about a month ago, where the central bank raised interest rates 3.5% in an effort to support the value of the ruble. So minimize this. This is looking at the value of the ruble relative to the dollar going back to 2004. The Russian central bank, Russian finance is hard money stuff. Primary budget surpluses at the federal level, but very, very hard money approach. You can see the ruble took it pretty. There was a shock to the ruble with the 2007-2008 crisis. This shock of 2014 was primarily a negative oil shock, a collapse in oil prices. There are more than a few commentators that say this is the result of the war in eastern Ukraine, the seizure, the annexation of Crimea, and the war in eastern Ukraine in the Donbass. But the fact of the matter is currency markets don't much move on sentiment. They work on supply and demand of actual currency. And the shock to the oil market, the collapse in oil prices, meant that a whole lot less currency was headed back into Russian accounts, and the ruble slid in value as a result. You can see the shock caused by literally a breakdown in the financial system, partly by controls in Russia, but also the the economic and financial war from the West. For much of last year, the ruble was actually overstrong. And there were some real concerns actually emerging out of the Russian business sector, exposed to the international trade side of things, and manufacturing is very exposed to trade. There was concern about competitiveness. But this move here, this slide in the value of the ruble, this is driven by a couple things. I would say first and foremost is there was a view within a clique within the Kremlin that easy money was to be had by devaluing the ruble against the dollar. That let's say you had, you were getting 75 rubles to the dollar. Well, inside Russia, they use rubles, they don't use dollars. And what a neat thing it would be if you could instead get 100 rubles for that dollar, and you didn't have to do anything. This idea of free money exists. And I will tell you, I don't know what you think about Vladimir Putin, but I watched him on explain this neat trick to a journalist on Russian TV, and Putin's knowledge of how finance works, how exchange rate works. I mean, he literally was holding fingers up. It reminded me of the, how does the internet work? Well, its information flows through tubes. So, anyways, so there is this fight that went on through the summer about between essentially nationalist with an expansionary minded approach to money versus the hard-nosed finance that one would find in the Russian bank or in the finance ministry out of the Kremlin. That battle is slowly being won by the central bank and by the finance ministry, as the carnage from this sudden slide in the value of the ruble, as that carnage really becomes obvious. And this slide in the ruble has significant inflationary implications for the trade-oriented parts of the Russian economy. And of course, trade is an important part of the Russian economy. So the importation of inflation, essentially. And you can see interest rates going back to 2004, very cyclical shocks. Again, the credit crisis and the Great Recession, the shock of the fall in oil prices, and the Ukraine crisis, if you will, and quite a number of sanctions that came in then. The shock of the war, the invasion itself, and now the shock caused by this ruble issue. But interest rates had considerably normalized for 6 months or so, this latter part of 2022 and the first part of 2023. Credit conditions were actually seen as to be a bit on the loose side. You see that, remember that money supply data and the general economic data of hot, hot, hot. Sanctions are pervasive, absolutely. It's quite striking, and this is from the point of view for the European Union. About half of Russian exports and nearly 60% of European Union imports from Russia are subject to sanctions. They're mostly technological goods, dual-use goods, meaning products that could be used both as in the civilian world, but also in the military world. Some significant hits to metals. Russia's got a very strong metals, a very strong steel sector for one, but also a variety of other metals, also the chemical industry products and some fertilizers. So Europe was Russia's big partner. The Western media and political people tended to get focused and fixated on one side of that equation, looking at gas, Europe's or Germany's dependence on Russian gas. And it certainly was a whole lot more than Gazprom was interested. They were looking for about a 33% market share, but it got up near 40% then the war and all that went around that. But Russia also was very dependent on Europe for imports of manufactured goods, capital goods, consumer goods. So the essentially this has gone to a relationship has gone to a balance. It used to be that Russia had ran a very large trade surplus with Europe because of the very large energy exports. But from the Russian standpoint, they were dependent on exporting energy to Europe, and they were very much dependent, and happily so, on importing cool stuff and fine and advanced stuff from Germany, et cetera, and elsewhere in Europe. Now, sanctions. Okay. This is a statistic that comes out of the Kyiv School of Economics. So you would expect them to be not exactly friendly to sanctions breaking, if you will. So the very interesting data came out, a report earlier this summer showing, in terms of the company's capital, who owns the companies, not where are they based, but who owns them. Okay. Sanctions are applied on this nation state framework. But as you know, a business like Apple or any major company has entities incorporated in many different jurisdictions around the world. And it turns out that for sanctioned electronics, that American companies, American owned companies, are the overwhelming source of sanctions breaking electronics. It's a different way of looking at things. Okay. But I think it's really instructive. One, it's instructive to how profoundly prominent US capital is in electronics worldwide. But it also shows that from the sanctions breaking, and it was a great report that came out of the, I think it was Canada. I'm trying to think of the Canadian banking. It might have been the central bank, talking about the effectiveness of sanctions. That really, in order to have effective sanctions, everybody's got to be on board. All suppliers have to be on board. Otherwise, you're kind of like squeezing the balloon, and the supply emerges to the sanctioned market from another source. Well, here you're looking at it's American capital that's behind most of this, and yet we're probably Ukraine's #1 champion in this war of resistance against the Russian invasion. Looking at the flow of goods into Russia from abroad, you can see where are the products manufactured. These are electronics again. China, Malaysia, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, United States. Look at the flows going through Hong Kong. This is not China. This is not legally China, okay? We can have a discussion about the role of China here, but this is, if you know, the whole thing about sanctions is legalism on steroids. And legally, Hong Kong is a separate jurisdiction from China. You know, there's a lot of heavy manufacturing, electronics manufacturing in the Maldives. I thought most everybody that went there went to hang out on the beach or swim in the ocean, but no. But this is really crucial, and companies know this. Just real quick, Chinese exports to Russia have held up and have been growing actually quite strong since the war. One of the strongest areas of growth in Chinese exports is vehicles, cars and trucks. Europe used to have a very strong position within the Russian vehicle market. They have lost that almost entirely. And the Russian public was suspicious for a generation or two, longer than that, but very suspicious about the quality of manufacturers from China. There's similar challenges that one would find in the West, even though many of those manufacturers in China are by subdivisions of Western companies. But it turns out that Chinese autos and trucks are working out pretty well, and the Russian public and companies are finding them attractive buys. I mean, they would like to get used cars from Japan and new cars from Europe, but things being what they are, it turns out that the Chinese are working successfully to build a long-term market share in a large market. Looking at the fossil fuel world, after this, not just the sanctions, but the embargoes by Europe, and Europe was the largest customer by far. Aggregate Europe was by far the largest customer of Russian hydrocarbons, be it crude oil, refined oil products, or LNG. This heat map showing the flow of fossil fuels. This is LNG flows from the north, but crude oil and refined oil products from the Baltic, from Novorossiysk on the Black Sea, from Kozmino in the Russian Far East. The markets are now in the south. Oil products being, what's the term, laundered in various markets abroad, with Russia being banned from supplying crude oil to most of Western Europe. Shipping times changed quite profoundly. This has altered the global flows of crude and oil products in a profound way. And markets that now see, like India and China, markets that particularly India, that now see large quantities of Russian oil and oil products, they're not importing from other places. So there's been this big shell game, this big reallocation of where supplies are coming from to meet demand. Europe is importing more oil and oil from the Middle East, oil products from the Middle East, from India, from China. Go figure. So what's going on is a massive increase in inefficiency, but more concern actually for me is that it's a huge investment in the dark side, and essentially economic activity that takes place in the shadows. You know, we in the United States, there are volumes of books, and American history was altered by prohibition against the sale of alcohol back in the 20s and the 30s, you know, and the impact that had on the rise of organized crime in the United States. Al Capone, firstly and foremost. I mean, it was really supercharged illegal activity in the United States and into the Caribbean, Cuba, et cetera, before the Cuban Revolution and all. So this is really quite a striking map. It requires a lot more tankers, basically 4 times the tanker fleet, because you not only sail full 4 times as far, but you also have to sail back empty. So it's just and because of the oil price cap that restricts the ability of, when prices reach a certain cap, European suppliers of ships and shipping services are not able to do so, including insurance. They're not able to do so. But what this is doing is it's creating incentives for the Russians to dramatically expand their tanker fleet. They are to take on board in-house shipping services insurance. They are. And it used to be that Russian crude and products were sold on an FOB basis. You get it on the ship, and that's when money changes hands. Now the transactions are taking place on essentially a CIF basis. Landed at the port of destination. When the ship arrives, then they pay you. And looking at the crude flows out of Russia, everything's going to Asia. This is seaborne crude, so it doesn't show the East Siberian pipeline portion that goes direct to China, 600,000 barrels a day through Skvorodino in the Russian Far East, and small, several 100,000 barrels a day. Basically, the Czech Republic is still on the still drawing from Russia through the Druzhba pipeline, but overwhelmingly things have left Europe and have gone to Asia. Another graphic here showing how that Asian market breaks down. China was always a big importer of oil from Russia, but then India is the big new market. Always was too far away. It didn't make sense logistically. Russian crude was not competitive in India because of the logistics. Sanctions have changed that. Now, de-dollarization. This is a broad topic. This isn't just about Russia. For I don't know for how long. There are all kinds of stories, articles and narratives on the periphery of finance about how the U.S. dollar is someday soon is going to, the U.S. will be bankrupt, and countries, other currencies, the Chinese yuan in particular, Chinese currency is going to become #1. A lot of urban legend, very little of it thought through to any degree at all. But the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has moved sanctions to an entirely new league. Sanctions were the sanctions on Iran were sanctions go back for a long, centuries. But in the modern context, the sanctions, Western sanctions on Iran, particularly American sanctions on Iran, were kind of a trial, an exploration, an innovation opportunity for the Iranians to figure out how to get around those sanctions. And there's been a lot of meetings and discussions about how the Iranian tricks of the trade, how the Russians can use them, and the Venezuelans as well. But I want to talk, before we go any further on here, this de-dollarization is an important issue for the 21st century. And it's really important to get the facts straight to kind of set the bedrock here before we go far. What is money? Money is a medium of exchange that facilitates an exchange of goods and services, and it's anything that's widely accepted as a means of payment. Medium of exchange. Then there's a unit of account, measuring the value of things. Then there's a store of value. Can you use it in the future? with money as a store of value, you can use it as a standard for future payments. Now, money is at risk to things like inflation and devaluation. But again, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. That's what money is. What's a reserve currency? So a reserve currency is money that a central bank or treasury holds as part of a country's formal foreign exchange reserves. And they use these reserves to weather economic shocks, pay for imports, service debts. If you take a loan from Citibank, a national, you borrow, $2 billion from Citibank. Well, you're going to have to pay Citibank in dollars, most likely. Countries also use these reserves to moderate the value of their own currencies and also to provide financial liquidity overall. Many countries, think in terms of low-income countries with histories of financial instability, inflation, etc., poor market development. Those countries can't borrow money or pay for foreign goods in their own currencies because there's no trust. So they need to hold reserves to ensure payments abroad. So I mean, this reserve currency idea is kind of an artificial one. It has taken on artificial connotations in that there's a club. Well, yes, there's a club, but you can get in that club without an invitation if it turns out that you produce a lot of goods that other people want to buy. For example, the Chinese. So, and liquidity, if you are a company and you are selling goods abroad, you want to match the costs within your supply chain, in your labor and everything. You want ideally you sell something for dollars so you can pay for your supplies in dollars, and your investors or shareholders, well, they want to be paid in the home currency that they live in, ideally. There's more flexibility on the investor side than there is on the supply chain side. But it's very inconvenient if you're a company in San Jose, you say a small to medium-sized company, even a multi-billion-dollar company. If you are doing business in, if you're selling abroad for dollars, well, that's great. But if you are selling abroad in other currencies to India for rupees or Australian dollars or even Japanese yen, or there's a myriad of currencies out there. There's a tremendous amount of suddenly you got to invest in your in-house financial capability to be a bank, and that's not really what companies are very good at. I mean, it essentially denominating your exports in the currencies of your customers raises your own costs. So having a common currency makes it simple for you to focus on your business and not on handling the money per se. And then the risk of devaluation, for example, or dealing in countries where there are capital controls, for example, India. You can't just move money in and out of India freely. Very challenging situation. So just looking at a particular case here that's been going on in recent weeks. about, okay, and this gets to the trust issue and the worry of countries and companies abroad, not just manufacturing companies, but financial companies as well, that you are somehow on the wrong side of the law or the wrong side of power in the United States or in Europe. Uh, if you're on the wrong side of a policy, if you are a manufacturer that depends on electricity produced from coal, in 5 years, are you going to be exposed to potential sanctions from Europe, not just carbon border adjustment mechanism, but are you going to be exposed to sanctions somehow as the politics of green uh, becomes supercharged against carbon? It's one thing to have market incentives. It's another thing to have policy. This International Emergency Economic Powers Act, this goes back, rooted in the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1917, and then was modernized during the Carter administration, essentially allowing the U.S. president to freeze and confiscate foreign assets. Well, if you're in Washington or you're on the side of the good and the glorious, uh, that's great. Or if you are on the side of imperial power, that's great. You can do what needs to be done. But if you're on the other end of this, you may have a different definition of what is good and glorious. So, anyways, this particular tanker incident. This will give you an idea of some of the complexity that gets built into, say, the oil market. You have a tanker company, Suez Unlimited, in the Marshall Islands, is the registered owner of this tanker. It's like a company built around one tanker. And the tanker is crewed and operated by Empire Navigation out of Greece. Okay. Well, there was an offshore shadow shell game in moving oil. But how did this company and tanker get exposed to American judicial tanglement? The ship was financed by an affiliate of LA-based Oak Tree Capital. So, I mean, these long-chained weaponizing the dollar and not just the currency, but all aspects of it has been a wake-up call for the last decade plus in the trade and the financial world. But with the sanctions on Russia, it supercharged it. We went from dealing with billions to tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, and it became a hot topic in asset manager world worldwide. Just recently here last week, Venezuela, Maduro was in Beijing trying to continue the relationship. The Venezuelans are under serious sanctions out of Washington on the oil, what's left of the oil trade. I mean, Maduro and company have pretty much really destroyed the sector, but it still produces something. And it's interesting from the Venezuelan side and from the Chinese side, a delegation that went in a week before Maduro went to visit the Shanghai International Energy Exchange and the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange. We commonly are used to hearing about pricing to Brent crude or West Texas Intermediate, off of markets in Europe, Chicago. But the Chinese have been developing their own exchanges, and they have a large flow of imports of crude and trade and products, and they are looking to price oil in their currency. Not more about gaining independence from the dollar than promoting the yuan as some sort of new reserve currency. This is as much a defensive mechanism as it is about offensive power projection, if you will. That as the Venezuelan oil minister said, that these exchanges are crucial for energy trade and contract formulation for futures in Asia. So, and indeed, what's the value of data on Brent or West Texas Intermediate, or even Dubai for that matter? What's the value of trade data out of those markets for energy markets, say in East Asia or China specifically? And the Chinese are still importing around 400,000 barrels a day of Venezuelan crude, but none of it goes direct, going through third countries such as Malaysia, all kinds of laundering going on with this. And the Venezuelans are interested in reducing the amount of middlemen. The big scandal for 2023 was a multi-billion-dollar scandal in the Venezuelan administration on stealing money, tens of billions of dollars of receivables that were supposed to go to PDVSA ended up in the pockets of others, and it's a huge scandal for Venezuelans. Not sure that anybody in DC cares, but it is a big deal, and it's one of the consequences of this weaponization and kind of moralization of trade. So when the war broke out in Ukraine, one of the first things that happened was from the West was to freeze central bank assets, Russian central bank assets. Russia had large reserves abroad, not just for the central bank, but their sovereign wealth funds had large, hundreds of billions of dollars invested abroad. It wasn't like they had it invested in some sort of checking or savings account at the Bank of England or something like that, or any particular bank. It's not how it works. In fact, it turns out that the actual seizure, in early days, was that maybe $300 or $400 billion worth of Russian assets was seized or frozen. Well, they may have been frozen, but nobody's doing any seizing. It seems that maybe a few tens of billions of dollars are going to be found. And this is separate from assets seized from oligarchs who were just kind of like we're walking down the street kind of thing. Some really sketchy thing. This was about politics, about sentiment, about gesture. But when it comes to the application of law, it becomes much more complicated, for one. And for two, with these large investment portfolios abroad, it's in a myriad of different instruments, a myriad of different instruments. Now, if you were able to get the banking records out of Russia, well, it'd be pretty easy to figure out who's got what. But I don't see the Kremlin releasing those anytime soon. And to figure out from the other end what the different instruments are, where they're located, when they expire, roll over, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it is immensely complicated. It is too complicated, and it will never happen. So now it's about, from the Western perspective, what you heard, what the real talk is: can we use the earnings from seized assets, and it's a lot of it's oligarch seizures that turned out to be the easy, lowest hanging fruit to actually seize and to freeze. It's not even freezing, but to see, excuse me. Seizing is one thing, freezing is another. And even if you have something frozen, there's an effort to find a way to peel off the income generated by those assets and use them to aid Ukraine in some way. Very complicated. The war, Russia's war on Ukraine is a crime. I mean, it's a total disaster. But and that's a political, that's a moral thing. But in terms of law, it's really important that the rule of law be sustained, and that makes it very challenging for uh, 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 those wanting to have a sweeping seizure of assets, because today it's about Russian assets. It could be about somebody else tomorrow. You know, uh, it's like militaries. An intelligent military person, they're not looking at somebody's intentions. They're looking at somebody's capabilities. The same thing applies if you're an asset manager, if you're a lawyer or an investment advisor. This is the perspective you need to be taking on the part of your clients.
So, David, a question. So when economic sanctions are put in place by, say, the US, is it in the form of is it an executive order? Is it a congressionally passed law?
Mm.
And does that include within it the definition of what the people who do the seizing are allowed to do with those assets?
Right. So indeed, there's two tracks for sanctions. One is through executive action, and that is overwhelmingly, and thank God, it is the track that has been taken by the U.S. In this instance. U.S. sanctions are being done through executive action. The ones that come from congressional passage of law are essentially impossible to end. They become almost permanent. Uh, and if the language guiding the sanctions law and policy issued by the executive, by the president, you can go to the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC. You go to that website and you can read all about any particular action on any particular asset and what your legal responsibilities are. And there are ways in which to challenge or to find some sort of waiver. They tend to be rather scarce, but that data is available on the OFAC website. The interesting thing, the root, one of the important roots of the euro-dollar market, which most reading will take you back to the 1960s and European surpluses, export surpluses with trade to the United States saw a buildup of US dollars in Europe. But even predating that was in the 1950s, the Soviet Union decided that they needed to hold their dollar reserves in the UK. And that was one of the earliest foundations of the euro dollar market, which is now a monumental market of its own, separate in many ways from the U.S. legal jurisdiction. But as one sees with the sanctions that have been applied to the Iranians and now the Russians, where the lines are, the extraterritorial application of American law, what's the limit of that reach? Well, better do your homework. Now, for the Russians, this is not a developing country. This is not a low-income country. This is a country with a lot of history and a lot of capacity, and has a multi-generation history of hard money, even during the communist era. Money's abroad. I mean, one of the things that killed the late Soviet period and ended it was inflation in the Soviet Union. It was not visible in terms of prices. It was visible because goods left the shops. That's kind of a separate topic. In terms of what's going on right now, one of the things that happened in the spring of 2022 in the natural gas trade in particular was that, while we Russians are willing to continue to sell gas to you in Europe, and this is before the the total, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, the pipeline across Poland, etc. Just a few supplies coming across Ukraine now still, or through under the Black Sea. But anyways, the Russians demanded payment in rubles. But right now, over 50% of Russian exports are being paid in rubles. Well, I was surprised. And this is yesterday. And again, this is Kommersant. This is basically the Wall Street Journal of Russia. The quality here is, I would say, higher than the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. There's less moralizing. It's pretty hard-nosed business. And in terms of the imports into Russia are still mainly in unfriendly currencies being the dollar and the euro and the pound. And rupees are still insignificant. Now, one of the big changes over the last decade, and it well predates the war in Ukraine, has been the role of the Chinese yuan in Russian finance, not just in terms of paying for goods and services, but also investment. These countries have a very long border with each other. Business relations have moved beyond transactional to there's substantial relationships built in, particularly in the energy trade. And because of that Russia exports large quantities of goods, fuels in particular, and imports large quantities of goods from China. So they export to China large quantities and they import from China in large quantities. There is a live and mobile market for yuan, not for financial purposes, but for trade purposes. So in terms of de-dollarization, this might be the most important pathway by which the dollar is shouldered aside in transactions, in trade transactions. But you need to have a viable market. If you, and I'll show you where there are some problems with this, but the relationship between China and Russia is a commercially viable one for developing a market for yuan, developing a market such that Russians could see this as a reserve currency because they can use it in the future, and that there's other countries that might be willing to use it as well. Just looking at the market liquidity, and this is in trillions here on the right. Okay, this is not like going down to the corner or 7-Eleven and trading currencies. The Western perspective of what Russia is and isn't. This is one of the problems that we're having in this war and supporting the Ukrainians, is that we need to take the Russians for who and what they are, not who we might imagine them to be or who we want them to be. But in fact, it's a major country. It's a serious country with a lot of capacity, way more capacity than Ukraine. And so in order for Ukraine to be supported, we're going to need to have this in Washington and Brussels. We're going to need to have this rather broad understanding of who the adversary is and what their capacities are. And in terms of trading of currencies, the fact that the yuan is trading at same volumes, is now exceeding volumes of the dollar, even with the dollar being restricted. Okay, it's not an easy thing to trade dollars inside Russia anymore. So you see dollar volume shrinking. But the yuan track is growing and growing and growing. Banks throughout Russia offering savings accounts in yuan to their domestic depositors. They're paying interest rates on it, just like they used to offer euro and dollar denominated accounts. So this is getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Russian, well, let's just carry on here. And in terms of reserve development, earlier this year, the Russian finance ministry converted its market operations to yuan instead of the dollar, and have, for the $160 billion national wealth fund, they're now, I wouldn't call it necessarily a mandate, but they're going to hold 60% of their assets in yuan. Now, China has capital controls. You can't move money freely in and out of China in a financial sense very easily, but you can pay for imports, and you can receive payment for exports, and that's outside capital controls. And that's why I say that the trade is the channel by which de-dollarization will develop over the decades going forward. And we're building up to a crisis here in the United States for sure in terms of our financial management at the federal level, and the risks for default, either by political purposes or by some economic or financial challenges. But again, trade is the channel by which de-dollarization is happening. So, Pakistan is dealing with a financial crisis this year and last year. It's not just because of the high energy prices there for a period, but the Pakistanis have a real bottleneck in terms of the need to pay for debt outstanding, to service outstanding debts. They've got too much payable too soon. And their export earnings are not easily covering that. So they're needing to do an IMF package or find other sources of financing abroad. But it turns out they had a pile of Chinese yuan in the central bank that they couldn't use to service those debts to banks or abroad, but they could use it to finance importing some tanker loads of oil from Russia. So they used the yuan to pay the Russians for discounted Russian oil. This is a couple months ago. The Russians are beginning to handle Indian rupees. So you remember the earlier chart where India has become Russia's first or second primary export market for crude oil. And there's long been talk, I'd say by more non-Russians and non-Indians even, about, wow, India could use rupees to pay for that oil. Well, there really is no financial infrastructure up until this last year. There's no financial infrastructure to handle those rupees. So I'm a business. Remember that business example of company in San Jose? There's a business in Russia that gets paid rupees for their trade. They sell oil, and they are paid rupees. They can't use rupees to pay their suppliers inside Russia. They need rubles. And there's no meaningful currency market for that domestically. And if there was, the margins for transactions would be fairly high, fairly expensive. So this is a dangerous thing for a company, that you build up piles of currency from abroad that you can't pay suppliers. Well, you could leave it in your bank account. Maybe you could have your bank would open a rupee account. Well, the bank doesn't want to hold this money they want to lend it or invest it. That's what banks do. They don't sit on a pile of money. They lend or invest or transact. But in this case, if someone is depositing rupees, what are they going to do with them? What's the bank going to do? Are they going to lend them inside Russia or outside Russia? And to who? And if they're going to invest them, to who and where? And for the Russian exports to India in the first 4 months of this year, rounding about $20 billion, imports only 1.3. This is pretty serious imbalance. Very different than the situation with China, where there's a large flow of Russian exports to China and a large flow of imports from China. This is with India, it's very much a wildly imbalanced situation where Russia exports, but India doesn't have anything that Russia wants in large volume. I mean, you can only buy so much coffee. And interestingly, we were talking about exchange rates, the value of the ruble, and they've had trouble in the last couple months with the valuation on the ruble. A former finance minister, Zdanov, was interviewed in Kommersant, and he said, Russia's building up about $1 billion a month in rupees, and we're not able, that money, that's not being converted into dollars. I mean, it used to be that oil being now sold to India for rupees, for example, it used to be sold to Europe for euros or for dollars. And so it was immediately that cash was immediately cyclable into the system. This is like a bubble of rupees piling up. And so he's questioning, is this actually a headwind to the Russian exchange rate, that the Russian economy is not getting the inflows that it was? It still has the outflows. So you can see this creating some, not just imbalances, but significant turbulence. And this is unresolved, and this is going to be a big problem for Moscow and for Delhi to figure out. I know I'm on time here, but we're getting close to the end. Now, one of the currencies that's not likely to be on the radar of many people on this call is the dirham. The dirham is the currency of the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is a very interesting place. Firstly, it's the home of Dubai, one of the great commercial capitals of this world. It's an important trade capital. The Emirates, an important transportation hub. It's an important source for crude oil and some natural gas to come. But it's also become a very important player in global finance. Not just as a destination for buying real estate in Dubai, but the financial institutions and the Emirati investing abroad, be it in green energy or other things. But that financial hub, that financial infrastructure has become a huge center of attraction for Russian capital and Ukrainian capital. When the war broke out, wealthy Russians and wealthy Ukrainians went to the same place, Dubai. It was a fascinating thing. And it turns out that this currency, created in 1973, shortly after the UAE became an independent country, before oil. Okay, this currency, and just a map here to orient those of you that may not know where the UAE is in this world, on the Persian Gulf, across from Iran, neighbor of Saudi Arabia. Outstanding leadership, absolutely outstanding, forward-thinking, very sophisticated, very pragmatic, and kind of the mentor. Al-Zayed is the mentor for Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. So I mean, this is a fulcrum of power in this world today. And if you don't know what's going on in the UAE and you're in the world of finance, you need to take a couple days and really sink yourself in to get a handle on what's going on there, not just in terms of opportunity, but capacity. UAE dirham is pegged to the US dollar at 3.67. This peg has held up for 25 years and there's no sign of it changing. If anything changes, it's going to be on the dollar side. So inflation, devaluation is not a factor for this. So if you are a company in Russia and you're involved in trade abroad, the dirham presents a very interesting opportunity as a transaction vehicle for trade, because the markets exist, the liquidity exists to transact, and the security of the asset is solid. This peg, this is a real, over the next few years, this is a really important place to be watching. The US is trying to contain the Emiratis, but the Emiratis are playing a very sophisticated, very intelligent, very pragmatic game of power. They understand power and being able to modulate it between China, with Russia, the United States, and now increasingly India. It's a place, I can't overstate how significant what is going on in Emirates is in terms of global finance outside the world of the dollar. Now, just at the G20, just a couple days ago, foreign minister of India, it's very, very Jayashkar, Jayashankar. Okay, I'm getting tired. This guy is as smart as they come, and he is a wily practitioner of geopolitics, very sensitive to the perspective of the view, not just kind of an anti-colonial, but pro-South, pro-global South, pro-India, pro-India. And India is one of the leaders of, we don't like the war in Ukraine, but we're not accepting you that this is the second coming of the devil, that we have national interests that we are going to pay attention to first. Our interests come before yours. And now this increasingly backed up by power. But in terms of this de-dollarization in trade, but the coming de-dollarization in finance, and remember that tanker being financed through a lease, through an affiliate of a financial group in LA, the global trust deficit. This is the great product of the sanctions on Russia because of its invasion in Ukraine, building on the roots of the colonial era, building on the roots of the so-called Washington Consensus, and a neo-imperial. This is not just about national interest of the United States, but the power projection of the United States or of Europe or of another country, but around the world, what they see and feel is American power. The extraterritorial application of American law. There always was a great deal of space given because of respect for, appreciation of what the United States stood for, but we have worn through that, and this emerging global trust deficit, not just in terms of politics, but in terms of finance, in terms of business. This is the This is what we have begun to invest in, starting in Iran with the sanctions, rather than, putting a fist in the collective face of the Revolutionary Guard. We play games in trade and finance because it's seen as there's no blood spilled and it's the easy way to apply power. But it turns out that you can apply it for a little while, but you're eroding the global trust. And that is, wow, that's a terrible thing in finance, is to lose the trust. Anyways, thank you all for your time and attention. I welcome any questions.
David, could you give us just a brief? I mean, you've thrown out a lot of information here. Can you summarize some conclusions from all this wonderful stuff?
Well, a number one conclusion is that okay, sanctions on Russia have not achieved their stated goal. Russia's economy is robust. There are problems. There are bottlenecks. There are issues that have been caused by sanctions, but overall, as an entity able to project military power in Ukraine, Russia has not only retained its capacity, but is now increasingly growing its capacity on the military side in terms of its military industrial complex. But the economy is solid, and people are not going to tell the Kremlin to go away because of some sort of weakness in their pocketbook. That's one. That the intended target, the intended result of the sanctions has failed, straight up. And second, that de-dollarization is a real thing. It's a narrative that's been long overplayed for political purposes. Political purposes, how do I say? Maybe someone doesn't like the Democrats, or Joe Biden, go Brandon, that kind of thing. But it even predates that, just this suspicion of Washington, suspicion of the Federal Reserve, suspicion of banks, big banks, that wow, we can't wait for somebody to come up with something that would put these guys in their place. Well, that was always a fantasy, but de-dollarization is a real thing coming. And it will come firstly through the trade channel, as countries use currencies other than dollars. And they were firstly given an incentive to do so, because by using dollars, they were putting themselves at risk of extraterritorial application of American law. So there suddenly developed a real incentive to finding other currencies to denominate trade, and that will spread into finance, but it will take time. But these are this transition, and it's very unlikely to end up in like no dollars and all one or something like that. We live in the modern age of unbundling and sophisticated markets. I think you'll see a variety of different currencies. I mean, if you have liquidity, if you have markets, deep markets, liquid markets that you can trade financial assets in, then de-dollarization creeps into the world of finance, not just trade. Those are the two biggest takeaways.
Can I follow up on that last question? I was curious if you just look at this in the short term, because the de-dollarization seems like a pretty long-term process. And you just say, okay, who's going to outlast who, right? You've got Ukraine on the side of the U.S. and Europe, and you've got Russia supported by China. Maybe you could make that argument, right? So what do you think in the short term, like who's going to win that? It's a waiting game. There's different things on different sides. So who do you think takes that takes that
So
game?
got it. It's a good question. So on a broad sense, yes, this is something that will take time, but there are narrow instances where it's happening now. And it's happening now in Russia's trade and financial relations abroad. It's happening at accelerated pace. When we come back and talk in 2 years or 5, but even 2 years, how trade is denominated will be substantially further down the road of using currencies other than the dollar. And this will provide and develop the market for the yuan to be used increasingly abroad in Latin America and Asia, as the depth of the market for this other currency deepens. Did I answer your question? I'll give you a follow-up if you'd like. Did I get to the?
I'm just curious, like if you see this going on for another 2 years, 3 years, and then the end game would be, Russia primarily gets what it wants, right? Or let's call it Europe primarily gets what it wants. Like just kind of your opinion on that based on these issues that are occurring in Russia. Russia economically survives this and, kind of keeps territory or ends up with the better hand in this, or the other way around.
We're headed into a very, very stormy, profoundly transitional period in geopolitics. The Russians are going to emerge out of this in better shape than most would have thought a year ago, or in the days of the invasion. There are huge consequences, negative consequences in Russian society because of this war. The skill drain is huge. It worsens some of the skills issues that were already a problem because of weakness in the education system in Russia. Is Ukraine going to get all their territory back? I don't think so. I don't see that. I don't see the power. I don't see the West intervening in a military way. And I don't see the Ukrainians at any point ever having the capacity to push the Russians out. The Russians are not going to be able to take more of Ukraine, but they've totally wrecked their relationship with the rest of Europe. It's just toxified it profoundly. But Europe has its own issues in terms of how it handles its east. The idea of inviting Ukraine into the European Union is immensely challenging. I mean, let's leave aside the happy talk about friends and ethics and democracy and all. Ukraine is a big country with a heavy ag focused economy that's got a demographic nightmare slanted toward old people. And the world looks much different in Brussels than it does in Bucharest or in Warsaw or in Kyiv. And the Europeans are going to have to figure out energy and economics. And there's still a trust deficit, a big one. There was a fascinating poll put out by Pew about the India. How do countries and people, how do people in different countries see the rise of India? And the polling out of Europe was shocking, that it was seen as a big negative. And I flipped this over into my Indian network, and people were they weren't appalled, they were dumbfounded. So there's this gulf that we're experiencing here in the United States between inside the Beltway. Similar kinds of things are all across Europe, where much of their populations are disconnected from power elite. China's got huge economic problems to deal with. Japan. India is not exactly on the march to the glorious future either. They have huge problems. I will say that 10 years from now, the world is going to look a whole lot different than it does now. It's just going to be really, really shocking.
Yep. Can I be rude and jump in with one last follow-up before everybody else? I'm
Yeah,
just curious, like if you were to split Russia, the economy, right? Because your point about the production all made a lot of sense. And then Russia kind of leadership, the kleptocracy, call it taxes, call it profits from government organizations primarily, and energy, right? And you were to say those sanctions and also the elimination of Nord Stream, right? Do you see where the Russian economy can actually survive and do okay because there's so much of a surplus sitting on top of it? They were collecting so much excess cash in the energy sector that could primarily be used however the government of Russia wanted, whether it was for the people or not, right? And now that would, to me, that would seem to be get the first bite, like the ability for the Russian government to do as it might would seem to be more limited today than it was 2 years ago, as opposed to the general Russian economy, which, based on your decrease of the value of the ruble and stuff like that, would seem to be able to do okay because there is so much excess capacity on the production side just available because of all the natural resources in Russia.
Well, again, coming back to the domestic economy in Russia, most of the capacity in Russia is in the services sector, some aspects of manufacturing, including those that are tied to raw materials. Russia's been hurt by essentially the gas blockade from Europe, the destruction of 3 of the 4 strings of Nord Stream. There's still one that somebody could use someday, although I don't foresee it anytime soon. This ruble crisis, I think, has been a wake-up call for the Kremlin to realize that their room for maneuver might not be as large as they thought. But the rebalancing, so over the next decade, Russian gas exports by pipeline to China will grow. Russian LNG exports, I expect to grow considerably. Russia used to be dependent on Japan, United States, or France, for example, for liquefaction modules for LNG production. They did not make that stuff in Russia. But Novatek, the developer for the Yamal LNG complex, Gazprom has a pipeline monopoly for pipeline gas, but Novatek operates in the LNG space, and Novatek is developed and patented now 2 different liquefaction technologies. And the question is, can Russian manufacturing scale up and commercialize that technology to expand LNG exports? The big weakness for the Russians out of this war is the impact on the IT space, the skills loss, the further deepening of the rot, kind of the political gulf inside Russia, where 60-70% of the public is depoliticized, just disengaged. There are real consequences for that, and there'll be real consequences when they get really engaged. We could talk a long time here, and I don't know whether I'm answering your questions.
It's okay. If anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to step back.
Any other questions, people?
I have a quick one. What happens after Putin?
Well, that's
little question.
Right. So it depends. My sense is that if he was to drop dead of a heart attack this afternoon, that there would be a period of collective leadership for maybe a year or two before the system identifies viable competing actors, players, and then the competition to coalesce around one. Russians aren't the only people that like to have a president. I don't see parliamentary style democracy having much future in Russia for a long time, for a lot of reasons we can get into. But again, your question specifically, who's after Putin, collective leadership for a period, and then one hell of a fight for supremacy. Maybe not unlike, I'm wary of bringing up names like Stalin because that that colors the conversation right away for many. But the post-Stalin period was a period of collective leadership, several years, and then Khrushchev emerged as the winner out of that. I think something similar.
Would a change from Putin change the ideology and the politics?
So one of the big criticisms in Russia, at really almost every level, is the corruption. So there's this gangland aspect. Like for example, what happened with not just the elimination of Prigozhin, but the influences on the right during the month of July and into August. It's a combination of corruption, the corruption of power from the Kremlin, but there's also great criticism about the corruption of money, because the religion in Russia in the post-Soviet era was money. And much of the economic elite is corrupt in the view of many Russians who tend to have an expansive view of kind of a spiritual approach to, they call it that, and sometimes you get some criticism of it, but there is a different approach, in the kitchen of Russians after a drink or two, talking about the purpose of government, the purpose of Russia. There's real interest in ending Putin's gangland approach, where loyalty is everything and competency and meritocracy essentially are nothing. And that is packaged up with the pursuit of money, where those with money go to the south of France, their kids are educated in the UK, where those people are committed to money, not to Russia. So the person that gets traction in Russia is going to have to speak to the leadership of Russia into the 21st century, deep into the 21st century. Who are we and where are we going and why? And there's a, like I say, there about the war in Ukraine, most Russians are either mystified or appalled that the Kremlin, Putin, invaded Ukraine. But the overwhelming majority, including this depoliticized group, do not want Russia to lose. They won't stand for it. and they'll fight. Believe me. So, oh, and the cancel culture was a complete disaster for the West and Russia. That was one thing that electrified that depoliticized space of, well, you don't like us because we're Russians? Wow, now we know who you really are. It was just a massive soft power disaster that I will not be repaired easily, just like Russian credibility in the West. We've done terrible things to each other and in Ukraine. So anyways, that future leadership is, if it's done in the midst of a crisis, it will be about the survival of Russia, and people will fall in behind that. But I think that that's where this period of collective leadership, and then being able to sell, who are we, where are we going, and why.
Can I ask a simple question? It's really kind of stupid, folks. Sorry. What's the unemployment rate and the poverty levels in Russia itself? I could argue against India being a superpower because the poverty level is enormous, and you have the caste system. So, but I'm just kind of curious. My history of Russia has shown that it struggles. People fall in line just because they're following the Politburo, and then it comes to a critical point and they revolt. So I'm just curious what the poverty level is. Are you feeding your people, etc., to keep them in line so that you can have that money?
So I would start from the position that, one, Russians are a pretty tough lot, still rooted in the countryside, no more than one generation removed, a highly urbanized society now, concentrated in the top 20 cities, in particular Moscow and St. Petersburg. A population that, for those over 30, remember the 90s really well, which were catastrophic, beyond the experience of probably anybody on this call, although I was there to feel it and to witness it. There is a there is a distinction between the urban and the countryside. Much of the staffing, if you will, volunteers or contract workers for Russian military are from the countryside, where there are very few opportunities, if any, outside of a bottle. Just a terrible, very few economic opportunities. But there are similarities, actually, in the U.S., where in the countryside, there hasn't been that much. So the military has been a route by which one could make a decent living, have some prestige, so it's easier to raise those soldier numbers in the rural areas, and that's where the death counts have been. Not just because they're keeping things from Moscow, which they are, but also because those that are have the traditional patriotic vibe, but also have the economic incentive, the social incentive to pursue that. The countryside is a mess still. A very sophisticated agribusiness has built up despite that. Unemployment in Russia is actually quite low. I don't have a number to give you right now, but there are labor shortages at every turn, especially any skills. But if you have no skills other than drinking, which is not popular in Russia now, but it is still in the countryside, one of the challenges for rural peoples is to have skills that are useful in the modern economy, not just high-tech IT economy, but good people skills. Is this somebody that you can have on the sales floor, somebody that's reliable to drive, somebody that saw engineering, for example, is a viable pursuit other than making easy money as a businessman or maybe a lawyer or a government employee, which is kind of the popular track now, is to hell with the private sector. Let's just get a government job and let it carry us. Russia is got a income inequality. It's significant, but not a lot different than the US in terms of percentages. The place is a long way from social instability. Let's be clear. It is a long way from social instability driven by economics. The Prigozhin thing was a warning in the sense that the activated, mobilized, nationalist, pro-war right felt that the Kremlin was and the military leadership were incompetent, and that Putin was himself responsible in an important way because he was accepting incompetence. He was preferring loyalty over competence. Why didn't he get rid of Shoigu or Gerasimov? I mean, by any measure in any other country, those guys would have been replaced. It's not that they may or may not be bad guys, but the performance has been abysmal. Get somebody else in the job. So in the field, Surovikin was brought in from Syria, and he had been brutally effective in Syria, and he was brutally effective in preparing Russian defenses in eastern Ukraine this last winter. And so the Ukrainian offensive has done quite poorly as a result of encountering a well-prepared defense. But Surovikin was a casualty of the Prigozhin affair. Anyhow, it's in fact the Prigozhin affair in many ways has been a stabilizing factor for the near to medium term for the Kremlin, because it has allowed them to crack down on the right, which is where the real angst was coming from. We need somebody that can get the job done right. And that's I don't see Putin being replaced. I really don't. I don't see the war going badly unless it expands into a war against NATO or with NATO. I think it's more likely that Putin dies in office.
David, I'll call it to a close at that point. A lot of interesting stuff, which obviously toward the end branched out into other issues involving Putin and the Russian government and the war itself in Ukraine. I guess a clear point is that
Are you frozen, Dan?
Looks like he is.
Accomplishing what their objective had been, which government to sue for peace, to come to the negotiating table, just not happening. And it sounds like you don't see that happening.
I don't see that. Yeah, I don't see that happening. I don't see the Russians coming to the table anytime soon, and I don't see the Ukrainians coming to the table anytime soon either, for their own reasons.
And I guess meanwhile, it is all served. I guess the folks who've benefited from all this is the military technologists on both sides are learning a whole lot about what works, what doesn't work, and it's going to be interesting to see, I guess, what develops. And also, I guess, some of the longer term implications of some of the things you're talking about, the increased use of the yuan. Will Russia ever become primarily? I mean, I guess there's just a lot of issues that we'll have to wait and let time tell us.
There are,
just
I'm sorry. Let's finish it.
Yeah, just to see what develops down the road. But appreciate, as always, appreciate your insights, the information, a lot of information, and we'll see how things develop. Okay, with our small group left, let me just thank everybody for coming. Just a reminder again that Charlotte will be sending out to the group very shortly the link to the recording of David's talk, and also a copy of your slides. David, you can send your slides to me and to Charlotte.
Yes, in PDF format.
Okay, good. And then we can get those out to folks. And Jim Carr will be sending out, for those who want CPE credits, Jim will send out the forms, so keep an eye out. Usually goes out within a week or 10 days. And get those. If you want CPE credit, be sure to get that back to Jim. Our next meeting will be on Tuesday, October 3rd. And just kind of something I'll mention to the remaining folks here. If there are any topics down the road that you would like to see a speaker on at the thing, and in particular, if you have any thoughts in mind about speakers whom you have heard or whom you know and who would be good for the San Diego thing, please let me know. Drop me a line. My email is on all the announcements that you got, and it's easy to find on the FANG website. Let me think, what else? Oh, and if anyone's interested down the road or now in helping out with the San Diego FANG, that's something I don't mention very often, but if anyone has an interest in helping run things in the group, let me know. And beyond that, thanks everyone again for coming, and we will see you in a month.